Hey guys, tonight we're unraveling the twisted tale of ambition, betrayal, and royal bloodshed, tucked under velvet drapes and behind diamond crowns. You're standing in the grand hall of Tudor England, breathing in the scent of beeswax candles and roasted venison. But the air here carries more than opulence. It's heavy with secrets. Somewhere down the corridor, a queen smiles too brightly. Somewhere else, a king sharpens his wrath behind a glittering mask of charm. This is the story of Anne Boleyn, but don't get too cozy, because by the end of this little bedtime tale, well, let's just say you probably won't survive this. 1. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world you're tuning in. From .now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You enter Whitehall Palace in the early 1530s, a labyrinth of polished wood, lavish tapestries, and suspiciously watchful eyes. Henry VIII is still in his prime, a towering, broad-shouldered monarch who speaks with charming bombast and eats like a Renaissance vacuum cleaner. The court is alive with dancing, lute music, and the occasional masked ball that definitely escalates into political scheming by midnight. Think Game of Thrones, minus the dragons, but with more syphilis. Amid all this, Anne Boleyn glides like a phantom. Not the fairest in the land, at least by 16th century standards, but hypnotic. Her eyes lock with yours across the room like she already knows something about your fate. And honestly, maybe she does. Her voice is low, smoky, intelligent. The kind of voice that suggests she could slice your confidence in half with a single sentence. She's not queen yet. Not even officially the king's mistress. But Anne isn't playing by the rules other women at court follow. She doesn't simper. She doesn't bat her lashes. She debates. She withholds. She disappears when the king wants more. It's not coyness. It's control. At this point, Henry is still married to Catherine of Aragon, his wife of over 2 decades. That should be a roadblock, but Henry's ego doesn't believe in roadblocks. He wants Anne. And when Henry wants something, God, or at least the Church of England, is expected to agree. Historians still argue whether Anne genuinely loved Henry, or simply saw him as a ladder to power. Some say she resisted his advances for years out of virtue. Others whisper she dangled herself just out of reach on purpose. A few even claim she practiced a little folk magic, her French education having exposed her to charms and talismans. You know, the 16th century equivalent of texting him, new number, who dis, and then manifesting a crown. But one thing's clear, Anne didn't sleep her way to the top. She made him wait, and wait, and wait. Meanwhile, the court begins to murmur. Catherine is growing older. Her inability to provide a male heir has made her position tenuous, despite her piety and royal blood. She's beloved by the people, but fading from the king's interest. You overhear noblemen at feasts tossing around phrases like great matter and annulment. Behind the curtains, England's stability quivers like jelly on a silver plate. And then there's Wolsey, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the king's right-hand man, frantically trying to keep the kingdom's marriage intact while keeping his own. Head attached. Spoiler, he fails at both. Anne can't stand him. She sees him as an obstacle to her rise, and frankly, she's not wrong. It's around now that Anne starts keeping score. You're beginning to notice that life at court is less about who you are and more about which whispers you listen to and which ones you start. Gossip is currency. Smiling too long at the wrong person could get you reassigned to somewhere cold and plaguey. Anne, on the other hand, seems immune to this paranoia. She plays the game, but always a step ahead. One day, you catch a glimpse of her holding a book by Tyndale, banned literature that challenges the Catholic Church's authority. She reads it openly, even as servants pretend not to notice. It's both a political act and a personal one. Anne's not just reshaping her life, she's setting fire to the mold entirely. Still, her position is dangerous. She's neither wife nor concubine. She can be dismissed at a whim or destroyed by scandal. She's betting everything on Henry's obsession, and obsession, you realize, can turn very quickly into revulsion. A quirky tidbit? Anne had 6 fingers. Well, maybe. Some chroniclers claimed she had a small extra nail or an elongated finger, a physical mark of the devil. Most historians now think that's nonsense, propaganda cooked up after her fall. But the image stuck. It's hard to erase an insult once it's woven into your myth. Just ask Marie Antoinette and her cake. And yet, as the months pass, Anne's power grows. Foreign ambassadors send anxious letters back home describing her intolerable pride and wit like a sword. They describe her laugh, her temper, her refusal to step aside. You're warned privately not to praise Queen Catherine too loudly unless you fancy losing your post or your kneecaps. Still, Anne hasn't won yet. The Pope refuses to annul the King's marriage. Rome won't bend. And Henry, frustrated, begins threatening to break with the Church entirely. You feel it, don't you? That tremor underfoot. England is changing shape, and Anne is the fault line. By the firelight one evening, you hear a court musician murmur, "She's not just after the crown. She wants a kingdom remade in her image." And for once, you can't tell if it's admiration or fear. So now you stand at the precipice. Anne Boleyn is no longer just a name whispered in royal halls. She's a force, and she's dragging a nation with her. You can't sleep tonight. Not because of the drafty chamber, or the howling wind, or even the suspicious creak of someone pacing 2 rooms away. No. It's because you know Anne Boleyn is having dinner alone with the king again. And that means something in England is about to snap. They say her laugh is sharper than a blade, that she can quote Latin poets and then toss out an insult disguised as a compliment before you've even blinked. She wears French hoods instead of the traditional English gable headdresses, and that's not a fashion choice. It's a statement. Anne doesn't want to fit in. She wants everything around her to shift to her rhythm. And Henry? Oh, he's dancing to her tune, all right. You remember Catherine of Aragon, noble, regal, the daughter of Spanish royalty. She was once the most powerful woman in England, but now she's more like a ghost drifting through palaces that no longer feel like hers. Henry, determined to rid himself of her, has already begun the legal gymnastics that will shake Europe to its core. The Great Matter, they're calling it, as if giving it a capitalized nickname makes it less scandalous. Historians still argue whether Anne encouraged the king to split from Rome, or whether Henry used her as an excuse to do what he already wanted. But here's what you know. Anne didn't flinch. She watched an entire kingdom teeter and still managed to smile over her goblet of wine. Of course, that smile might have had a bit of arsenic behind it. There's a story you overhear. whispered, barely audible behind a tapestry. Anne once told a rival lady-in-waiting, "My neck is slender," delivered with a smirk. No one knows if she meant it as flirtation or foreshadowing. Honestly, it could have been both. In this chapter of her rise, Anne is not just Henry's obsession. She's his revolution. He's broken from the Pope. He's declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. He's tossed centuries of Catholic authority into the Thames with a smug grin. All for Anne. A normal woman might shrink under that pressure. Anne doesn't. She thrives in it. You see her walk into rooms like she owns the air itself. When people bow, she waits half a heartbeat too long before acknowledging them, just enough to remind them that the game has changed, and she's now the queen-in-waiting. At a masquerade ball one evening, Anne appears dressed in golden silk, embroidered with Tudor roses, before she's even been crowned. Catherine is nowhere to be seen. And Henry? He doesn't look away from Anne for a single second. It's not love in his eyes, it's possession, like he's finally caught the storm he's been chasing. You overhear jokes in the kitchen. If Anne's not queen soon, someone's losing a head. And they don't just mean metaphorically, quirky. Fact time. Anne's dog was named Pourquoi, derived from the French pourquoi, meaning why. Apparently, because the little pup had a questioning expression. Sadly, one day Pourquoi fell from a window and died. Anne was devastated. Henry bizarrely broke the news via a courtier like it was a royal affair. Yes, even pets weren't safe from palace drama. But as Anne's influence grows, so does her list of enemies. Nobles who once feasted with her now exchange glances when she passes. The Seymour family, particularly one Jane Seymour, is suddenly invited to more royal hunts. A quiet girl, Jane, blonde, unassuming, the kind who blends in until she doesn't. You. Don't think Anne notices? Oh, she notices. But she plays it smart, for now. When Anne is finally crowned queen in 1533, it's like thunder rolling across the rooftops of England. The people are divided, to say the least. Many cheer. Some throw rotten fruit. The coronation itself is sumptuous, more like a theatrical performance than a holy rite. But unlike Catherine, who was crowned as both wife and future mother of kings, Anne's ceremony feels defiant, almost spiteful. Even the crown she wears is the one made for St. Edward, traditionally reserved for monarchs themselves, not consorts. It's not a subtle move. Anne wants the world to see that she's more than just a queen. She's a power in her own right. Still, something gnaws at the edge of the celebration. You feel it. A sense of unease buried beneath the clink of goblets and the blare of trumpets. Because here's the thing. She's pregnant now. The king's gambit is in motion, and everything rides on the hope that Anne delivers a healthy male heir. And this is where your stomach starts to twist. Because history, as you know, isn't always kind to women with high expectations. But in this moment, as Anne glides past you in her crimson and gold coronation train, her belly already slightly rounded, her head high and unbowed, you'd think she'd already won. One of the foreign ambassadors later writes that Anne looked more like the mistress of ceremonies than a pious queen. But you see something else behind her eyes. She's terrified, exhilarated, standing on a razor's edge with the whole world watching, and daring it to blink first. She reaches the throne, kneels, and rises with a grace that feels practiced, but still electric. The crown is set on her head. The cheers rise. The incense clouds the air. And just before you look away, you swear Anne glances right at you, like she knows how this ends. You're holding your breath. Everyone is. Anne Boleyn is queen, yes. But in this court, titles are like glass, gleaming, fragile, and one bad jostle from shattering. What secures her place now isn't coronation robes or jeweled headpieces. It's that unborn child growing inside her. England is watching Anne's belly like it's a national monument. By now, even the stable boys have heard the rumor. If this child isn't a boy, the tides will turn. Not gradually, not politely, like a full-throated roar of the sea crashing down on a sandcastle. And finally, after months of tension that could wrinkle steel, the baby arrives. It's not a son. It's a girl. A healthy, squirming, reddish-faced little thing, screaming her lungs out, unaware she's just turned a kingdom's hope into disappointment. Elizabeth is her name. You don't know it yet, but she'll become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. But to Anne, to Henry, right now, she is simply not a boy. The palace tries to keep the mood jubilant. Henry makes the usual fatherly proclamations, hands out wine, makes a few jokes at court dinners, but you see the glint in his eye when no one's looking. That "we'll try again" glint. The one that already erases Elizabeth before the ink dries on her birth scroll. Anne, meanwhile, begins her slow, spiraling transformation from dazzling triumph to hunted queen. Historians still argue whether Anne truly suffered postpartum depression or if her mood swings were simply political fuel for her enemies. But you watch her closely. She doesn't eat as much. She laughs less. She snaps at her maids. Her confidence becomes brittle. The court used to orbit her. Now it starts to drift. But don't think for a second that Anne gives up. She tries again. And again. Each time the stakes double. She has at least 2 more pregnancies. One ends in miscarriage, the other perhaps a stillbirth. Rumors swirl about deformities. One whispered tale claims she delivered a child with monstrous features, but most scholars agree this is slander, deliberate lies planted by those who want her gone. Still, the losses chip away at her. A quirky footnote? Anne was a patron of music and owned a specially crafted virginal, an early keyboard instrument. She liked to play melancholy songs herself, often in the late evenings. You imagine her there, pale fingers dancing on ivory keys, surrounded by shadows, trying to drown out the weight of expectation with a few soft notes. Meanwhile, something far worse than disappointment begins to creep in. Competition. Jane Seymour has entered the chat. She's quiet, docile, and, most crucially, untainted by scandal. Henry's eyes begin to stray, and Anne sees it happening in slow motion. Jane doesn't fight, she doesn't flirt. She just exists in the perfect opposite space Anne once occupied. Silent where Anne was bold, submissive where Anne challenged. It's infuriating. Anne's behavior becomes erratic. She argues with Henry in public. She accuses him of affairs. She calls Jane that pale snake, and probably a few less printable things as well. Henry starts retreating. His affection withers. His courtiers stop bowing quite so deeply when Anne enters the room. You notice it too. The air thickens with apprehension. Invitations to Anne's gatherings thin out. Courtiers begin praising Jane's virtues in the same breath they question Anne's judgment. It's not just a shift, it's a landslide, and Anne is standing right in its path, trying to hold back the rocks with her bare hands. One evening you catch Anne in the corridor, speaking to her brother, George Boleyn. Their conversation is too low to hear, but her expression is desperate. George looks solemn. You feel the chill of something about to break, and break it does. It starts small, a whisper here, a smirk there. Then rumors bloom like mold in damp linen. They say Anne laughs too freely with her male musicians, that she flirts with courtiers, that maybe, she's not as faithful as a queen should be. Historians still argue about the source of these accusations. Were they seeded by Thomas Cromwell, the king's brilliant and ruthless minister? Was Jane Seymour's family behind it? Or was it Henry himself, who now needed any excuse to rid himself of a queen who had failed to give him a son? What's certain is that you start seeing less of Anne. She no longer attends as many feasts. Her usual shimmer seems dulled, her gowns darker. She still holds her head high, but her steps are cautious. She's surrounded by eyes, not in awe anymore, but in calculation. You're at court the night the king publicly rebukes her for the first time. A small thing. He accuses her of scolding a servant in his presence. But it's loud, deliberate. The room falls silent. Anne's smile freezes like glass. Henry doesn't look back. And then, it happens. Anne miscarries again. This time, the fetus is reportedly male, and she knows that was her last chance. She clutches the bedsheets, pale and shaking, and whispers to her ladies, "I have miscarried of my joy." You don't need to ask what she means. That unborn boy was her lifeline, her salvation, her invisible crown, and now it's gone. That night, thunder rolls outside. The court is quiet. Even the jesters don't joke. Somewhere down the hall, Jane Seymour is reading scripture by candlelight. Somewhere else, Thomas Cromwell is writing letters. And Anne Boleyn. She lies in bed, staring at the ceiling. There is no more room for error, and there are far too many people watching, ready to pounce the moment she slips. You wake up, and everything's changed. Not visibly, not yet. The palace still hums with its usual courtly routine, silver platters clinking, heels tapping across polished floors, servants whispering in corners. But you feel it, a pressure in the air. A faint electric hum beneath the wallpaper. Anne is about to fall, and the trap is already being built. Plank by polished plank, word by poisonous word. You see it begin in the quiet corners, those shadowy spots where people speak in riddles and wear polite smiles like masks. Thomas Cromwell, the king's master of operations, has been conspicuously silent lately. You hear that he and Anne had a falling out, over money, of all things, over the confiscated wealth of the dissolved monasteries. Anne wanted it used for education and charity. Cromwell wanted, let's say, more flexible priorities. Historians still argue whether Cromwell orchestrated Anne's downfall for personal gain or at Henry's command. But one thing is clear. The friendship is over. And in Tudor court, friendship is usually the thinnest layer of armor between survival and sudden arrest. Meanwhile, Henry's face hardens. He doesn't look at Anne the same way anymore. In fact, he doesn't look at her much at all. He walks with Jane Seymour on his arm now, eyes warm with something dangerously close to affection. She wears pale colors, simple gowns, and a virtuous little half-smile that drives the knife in deeper. Jane is the antidote to Anne's poison, at least in Henry's eyes. You see Anne watching too, her face impassive, but her hand clenched tightly around the back of her chair. The court starts humming with suspicions. Small things at first. Anne is said to have flirted too warmly with the court musician, Mark Smeaton, that she speaks too often and too privately with her own brother, George, that her laughter carries just a bit too long through the halls, and that's all Cromwell needs. The accusations begin. Mark Smeaton is arrested first, a musician, bright, talented, and unfortunately vulnerable. He vanishes one morning, dragged into the Tower. When he reemerges, he's confessed to adultery with the Queen. Under torture, of course. Mark's confession opens the floodgates. Next comes Sir Henry Norris, one of the King's close friends and Anne's loyal supporter. Then Sir Francis Weston, then William Brereton, then George Boleyn. Yes, her brother. The charge? Incest. You'd think someone made that up after two. Much wine, but no. That's the official story being whispered through stone corridors now. That Anne seduced her own brother in a desperate attempt to produce a son who could pass for the king's. Most scholars agree these charges were fabricated, crafted, for maximum shock value and minimum plausibility. But Cromwell didn't need real crimes. He just needed the suggestion of scandal, and a king who was more than willing to believe it. And Henry? He's all too willing. Here's the quirky, almost absurd part. Anne is arrested while watching a tennis match. She's summoned mid-game, told, "The king has commanded her presence." She's confused, laughs, nervously. Her heart is racing. She never finishes her match. You remember her as she's led away, pale, silent, but holding her chin high. She knows how this court works. She's played this game better than anyone. But now she's a pawn again, or worse, a liability. Anne is taken to the Tower of London. And not just any entrance. She's brought in through the Traitor's Gate, the waterway usually reserved for the condemned. The symbolism is not lost on her. Inside, she's housed in the same royal apartments she once stayed in before her coronation. The irony stings, like being crowned and condemned in the same room. Anne's interrogations begin immediately. She denies everything. Her words are precise, measured, sharp. She mocks the accusations, laughs at the absurdity. But her laughter is starting to sound brittle. Meanwhile, those accused alongside her begin to fall like dominoes. Smeaton doesn't recant. He can't. The others deny all charges, but it doesn't matter. Trials are held in name only. The verdicts are foregone. Conclusions. Anne writes desperate letters from the Tower. One, supposedly smuggled to Henry, pleads for fairness. She swears her innocence, appeals to their past love. She writes, "Never prince had a wife more loyal in all duty." Henry never replies, and in public, he's already wearing Jane's favor at tournaments, already speaking of his new beginning. He's cutting Anne from his life with surgical precision. The Tower becomes Anne's whole world. The walls feel closer each day. Her ladies, assigned by the crown, aren't her friends. They're spies, reporting everything she says. When Anne laughs too loudly, it's noted. When she cries, it's written down. Even her dreams, if whispered, become royal intelligence. One night, she breaks down, talking aloud in confusion. "Did I not do well for him?" she asks the room, though no one answers. "Did I not give him all?" You don't know what to say. No one does. Even her enemies start to feel uneasy. Historians still debate whether George Boleyn's trial was meant to shame Anne or simply tie up loose ends. Either way, the charges are grotesque. There's no real evidence, just court gossip, manipulated confessions, and a king's icy silence. Anne's trial comes last. She appears before a jury of peers, including some who owe their titles to her downfall. She speaks with force, clarity, a quiet dignity that surprises everyone. Even her enemies whisper, she has courage, but it doesn't matter. The verdict, guilty of adultery, incest, treason. The sentence, death by burning or beheading at Tiata. The king's discretion, and the king, he chooses beheading. Merciful, they say, as if there's anything merciful about murdering the woman you once tore the world in half to possess. The air in the tower is heavy now. You don't breathe too deeply, as if inhaling this place might make it harder to leave. It smells like damp stone, old iron, and unspoken finalities. Anne has stopped pacing. She sits by the window more often, now her gaze resting on nothing in particular, just the distant trees, the gentle gray of an English sky. She's waiting. The others are gone. Mark Smeaton, George Boleyn, and the rest executed, swiftly, publicly, and with disturbing efficiency. George's trial had a grotesque flair. They read aloud personal letters Anne had written. There were even whispers of unnatural familiarity between them. That part makes your skin crawl, not just for its cruelty, but for its precision. These weren't just charges. They were character assassinations sculpted with surgical detail. Anne wasn't allowed to say goodbye to George. She asked, she pleaded. They refused, so now she waits alone. Henry, meanwhile, is planning his wedding. Yes, already. Jane Seymour has moved to a more prominent residence. Courtiers speak of her as if she's the next queen, because, well, she is. The king's mood has brightened. He hunts, he laughs, he flirts in public. You hear he even dances again. It's obscene. Anne knows the date is set. Her execution has been scheduled for May 18th, 1536. She spends the days before it with an almost eerie calm. She prays. She arranges for her belongings to be passed on. She confesses to nothing. A curious historical note. Anne requests a special executioner. Not a local headsman, but a swordsman from Calais, famous for his precision. She wants a clean death, not an axe that might take 2 or 3 blows. The request is granted, and that's rare, unprecedented even. Some say it was Henry's final gift to her. Others say it was just good optics. Historians still argue whether Henry was racked with guilt or utterly indifferent in these final days. He certainly didn't visit, didn't write, didn't send a message, but on the evening of May 17th, he dined well, played cards, slept peacefully. Anne didn't. That night she prepared to die. One of her ladies later claimed she heard Anne rehearsing how to place her hands, how to kneel properly, practicing her final words aloud, over and over, as if she might somehow perfect her exit, even if her life had unraveled. And then, suddenly, a twist. At dawn, Anne is told her execution is postponed by a day. No explanation, no warning. She's already dressed in her final gown, gray damask, with crimson undersleeves like a bleeding ghost. Her hair's pinned back. She's ready. And now she must wait. Again. You sit near the door as she sighs, deeply, and removes her cloak. She says, "I thought I was prepared, but they won't. Even give me that. It's cruel in a way few things are, false hope wrapped in silence." The following day, May 19th, 1536, is still. The morning air has no bite, just that soft dampness that clings to everything. You can almost pretend it's peaceful. Almost, Anne. Dresses again. Same gown, same pin-straight posture. Her face is calm. You want to look away, but you don't. Not now. She walks to the scaffold in the Tower Green, not the public execution site. A more private death, but not private enough. A small crowd gathers. Nobles, ambassadors, soldiers. Courtiers jostle. For position, not wanting to miss this moment, this royal spectacle. You spot Jane Seymour's brother in the second row. Of course. Anne climbs the steps, slowly, carefully. She looks thinner than before, but she stands tall. Here comes a moment you've likely heard quoted before, but seeing it is different. Hearing it in her voice is haunting. She turns to the crowd and says, "I am come hither to die, and I die a true Christian woman, and I do not accuse any man nor anything. I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never." She forgives him. Publicly. Do you believe her? Historians still argue whether her words were sincere or simply tactical, an attempt to die with grace, to protect Elizabeth, to preserve some legacy. But either way, she says it, and then she removes her headdress. Her long neck is exposed. She kneels. The ladies tie a blindfold over her eyes. She begins praying aloud. The French swordsman is silent. He steps behind her. "Unseen, you've heard," he says softly. "Bring me the sword," as a distraction, though he already has it in hand. A kindness. A lie meant to ease her final second. And then, just like that, it's done. One stroke. You don't hear a scream, only a thud. And then gasps from the crowd. The headsman lifts her head briefly. The body twitches. Her ladies rush. Forward, trembling, sobbing, trying to cover her with linen. There's no royal fanfare, no music, no moment of silence. It's just over. And here's your strange, almost literary quirk. Anne's lips were said to move for a few seconds after the beheading. Some claim she continued to pray. Others insist it was just nerves firing. But it's recorded all the same. Anne's remains are placed in an arrow chest, a wooden box far too small for a queen. No grand tomb, no marble slab. Just hurried burial, beside the chapel in the tower. Elizabeth, her daughter, is 3 years old. She won't see her mother again, but she'll remember her. And decades later, When Elizabeth becomes queen herself, she never publicly names Anne. She wears no locket, makes no grand memorial, but in private, she never forgets. You sit back, barely breathing, as the dust settles on the scaffold. Anne is gone, but her shadow lingers, long and complicated. It clings to the court like a perfume that refuses to fade, equal parts intoxicating and acrid. You thought her story ended with the sword, didn't you? But no. Death is just the opening act of legacy. Back at court, everything shifts overnight. Jane Seymour is installed as queen less than 2 weeks later. Less than 2 weeks. That's barely enough time to scrub the blood from the scaffold stones, but here she is, pale, demure, obedient. The very opposite of Anne. The courtiers pivot with the elegance of trained dancers. The same people who once praised Anne's wit now whisper about her wildness. The same men who toasted her health now discuss how unfeminine she was. You almost admire their flexibility, if not for the nausea it brings. Henry appears, renewed. He rides, hunts, hosts banquets. The weight that dragged him down during Anne's trial has lifted, or perhaps he simply dumped it on her grave. He's a widower of his own making. And Jane? She remains quiet, spectral. She never mentions Anne's name. Not once. Historians still argue whether Jane ever felt guilt over how she came to wear that crown. Some claim she was merely a pawn. Others suspect she was more calculating than her soft expression let on. But one thing's certain, she didn't protest, and now whispers begin again. But different ones, because while Anne's voice is silenced, her ghost is persistent. Strange things start happening in the tower. The yeoman warders speak of hearing footsteps in the Queen's house. Footsteps when no one's there. A swish of skirts, the faint scent of rose oil. Some claim to have seen a pale figure walking along the battlements, headless, gliding, searching. Now you're thinking, all right, fine, ghost stories. But the tower is no stranger to hauntings. And Anne's is one of the most frequently reported. Even centuries later, soldiers stationed there swear they've seen her. Quirky tidbit? In 1864, a guard claimed to have seen her ghost and charged it with his bayonet, only to faint from shock when the blade passed clean through. He was court-martialed for sleeping on duty, until others confirmed they'd seen the same apparition. Legacy's a funny thing, isn't it? While Anne's physical remains were crammed into a crude chest beneath the floor of St. Peter ad Vincula, her influence stretched far beyond. Her daughter, Elizabeth, is taken from court and placed under the protection of Henry's relatives. No one knows what to do with a princess who's now been declared illegitimate. Her mother executed for treason, her birth called into question. But Elizabeth watches, learns, endures. And in a strange twist of fate, Anne's greatest revenge would come not from the grave, but from the throne. Let's fast forward briefly, but just enough to glimpse the irony. When Elizabeth becomes queen years later, she steers England through religious turmoil, foreign invasions, and countless assassination plots. She becomes the monarch her father always wanted, a ruler with steel in her spine and velvet in her words. She never marries, never gives a man power over her name, her body, her crown. Sound familiar? You wonder, did she remember the sight of Jane Seymour smiling beside her father? Did she remember the whispers about her mother's sins? Did she lie awake some nights wondering what Anne had whispered to the sky in her final moments? There's no public monument to Anne in Elizabeth's court, but look closer. Anne's supporters quietly return to favor. Her portrait reappears, framed in subtle gold. Elizabeth commissions a ring locket with 2 miniature portraits, one of herself and one of a mysterious woman in French hood and pearls. It's Anne. So no, Anne's legacy didn't die on that scaffold. It went underground, then bloomed again, and the historical reappraisals begin. For centuries, Anne is painted as a temptress, a homewrecker, a witch even, literally. Some chroniclers accuse her of casting spells on Henry. They write about her 6th finger, her witch's mark, her supposed deformities. Total nonsense. Likely Tudor propaganda, crafted by her enemies. Modern scholars believe she had a slight nail growth or a birthmark, twisted by rumor into demonic features. Because, of course, a clever woman with opinions must be unnatural. Still, historians disagree. Was Anne a feminist icon ahead of her time, or a political climber who flew too close to the sun? That's the debate that keeps echoing through lecture, halls and late-night pub conversations. Did she love Henry? Was she a martyr, or merely another noble tangled in the Tudor meat grinder? You know what's fascinating? Anne Boleyn never wrote a memoir. No confessional scrolls. No secret diaries discovered centuries later. Her voice, her real voice, is gone. All we have are letters, rumors, trial notes, and second-hand accounts. And yet she speaks louder now than most who lived twice as long. That's the haunting part, the real ghost story. You see, Anne's horror isn't just in how she died, but how perfectly she embodied a court that devoured its brightest stars. How she was lifted as high as a queen and dropped as low as the tower floor. How she built a legacy out of ashes. And then, out of nowhere, something soft cuts through the fog. A nursery rhyme. You hear it sometimes, recited by children who don't know its origin. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. Anne is the beheaded, neatly slotted between Catherine of Aragon and Jane Seymour. A beat in a macabre rhyme, a historical bullet point. But you know better. You were there, and her story is not a rhyme, it's a reckoning. The tower doesn't forget. You try to leave it behind. Anne's final breath, the cold stones under her knees, the unnatural hush after the sword. But it lingers in the marrow of the place. People say the tower has layers, like sediment or scars. If that's true, then Anne's blood is one of the oldest and most stubborn stains. But outside the walls, the world moves on. Anne's name becomes dangerous. Her family is scattered, disgraced. Her daughter Elizabeth now bears the label bastard, just like Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter before her. Funny, isn't it? Henry keeps rewriting history, erasing wives like typos in a royal manuscript. But what he can't erase is perception. Because here's the strange part. Anne's death doesn't make her vanish. It makes her mythic. Even in her downfall, she's spoken about in whispers of fascination. Catholic Europe calls her the concubine queen, the Jezebel of England. Protestants? They call her a martyr, a woman who died for reform, for truth, for breaking Rome's grip. Which wasn't exactly Anne's plan. Historians still argue whether Anne ever truly believed in Protestant ideals, or simply used reform as a political ladder. She certainly owned banned books, corresponded with reformist thinkers, and advocated for English translations of the Bible. But was it faith or strategy? Either way, her image gets hijacked by both sides. Saints and devils are rarely allowed to be people, and while the Boleyn name becomes taboo at court, it remains a powerful symbol. In secret, poets write veiled tributes. Artists include her likeness in allegorical paintings, often hidden behind symbols like falcons, broken scepters, or even fire. Let's talk about that falcon. Anne's personal badge was a crowned white falcon standing on a tree stump from which red and white roses bloom. A strange image at first glance, but also layered. The falcon represents pride, nobility, fierce femininity. The stump, her family's obscurity. The roses, Tudor unity. Even now that badge appears in royal heraldry, ghostly evidence that Anne never really left the stage. Meanwhile, Jane Seymour becomes pregnant. You feel the gears of monarchy grinding again. The pressure, the anticipation. Everyone's watching, because if she gives Henry a son, she cements her place in the pantheon of good wives. And in 1537, she does. Prince Edward is born, healthy and pink-cheeked, and Henry is beside himself with joy. He finally has what he sacrificed so much to get: a male heir, a son to carry his name. Jane, though, she dies days later from postpartum complications. Just like that. And here comes your quirky historical footnote. Henry buries Jane beside himself in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. She's the only one of his 6 wives to share his tomb. The only one he called his true queen in the end, even though Anne changed England more than Jane ever did. It's like a bad joke with a grim punchline. The woman who gave Henry the heir he wanted gets the honor. The woman who gave him the heir he needed gets a locked box in the tower floor. But that's history. Messy, unjust, edited by survivors. And yet Anne's influence is far from buried. Let's zoom out. Because beyond England, across Europe, the Reformation continues to rip the continent apart. Monasteries fall. Priests marry. The Bible is printed in tongues the Vatican never approved. England becomes an island, not just geographically, but ideologically. And Anne, her name keeps surfacing in these upheavals. Not officially, not loudly, but as a kind of whisper in sermons and pamphlets. She becomes a symbol, not always accurate, but always potent. And here's a detail you might not know. Anne was the first English queen to be executed. Ever. Let that sink in. There were disgraced consorts before, banished wives, poisoned duchesses probably, but never a public beheading of a crowned queen consort. Anne broke ground in life and in death. You wonder, did Henry regret it? Some say yes. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, that years later he mentioned Anne wistfully. Others say he never spoke her name again, that he locked it away like a shameful indulgence. Historians still debate it. Some argue he felt haunted by her ghost, metaphorically or otherwise. Others say he hardened, learned to sever affection from governance, to cut cleanly, like that French sword. Regardless, one truth remains. Anne didn't vanish. You see her in Elizabeth's eyes, in the Protestant Bible beside a noblewoman's bed, in the Tower's tourist plaques, in the way women remember her, not just as a victim, but as a force. Even now, playwrights can't leave her alone. Shakespeare barely mentioned her, interestingly. Too political, too raw, but later generations made up for it. Anne's story gets retold again and again, in opera, in novels, in lavish miniseries with suspiciously good lighting, and each version casts her differently. The seductress, the scapegoat, the reformer, the tragic queen. You start to realize that maybe Anne's greatest act wasn't her rise or her fall, but her refusal to stay in one box. She keeps slipping out. Even when they try to simplify her, she resists. Even when they cut off her head, she remains composed. So here you are, centuries later, lying in the dark, eyes wide, thinking, what kind of person knows they're being used, and still reaches for the crown anyway? Maybe someone like Anne. Maybe someone who believed that legacy, real legacy, isn't about surviving. It's about leaving something behind that survives for you. You lie still, letting the quiet creep in, but Anne's echo has other plans. Because while the world turns, Elizabeth grows. She isn't simply the aftermath of Anne's story, she's the continuation, and you can't understand the horror of Anne Boleyn's execution without peering into the life her death made possible. Elizabeth is cautious. Raised in a series of country houses with a staff trained to avoid eye contact and scandal, she learns early that her mother's name is best left unsaid. Her status is murky, always one breath away from disgrace, bastardized, legitimized, then bastardized again. England's political weather changes hourly, and Elizabeth learns to read the skies. Her tutors teach her languages, history, philosophy, but she teaches herself how to survive. You picture her curled in a window seat with a French primer, reciting Latin conjugations while pretending not to hear the ladies-in-waiting gossiping outside her door. The Boleyn girl's child. Dangerous blood, that. Still, the flame of Anne flickers somewhere behind Elizabeth's famously unreadable eyes. She masters court etiquette but never relies on it. She charms nobles but never promises. And love, that's another matter. Suitors are paraded before her like desserts at a banquet. She nibbles, she flatters, but she never bites. People wonder, why won't Elizabeth marry? You could argue trauma. She saw her stepmother, Catherine Howard, be executed for adultery. Same charge as her mother. You'd hesitate too. Others say she was married to her throne, devoted to duty. Or maybe, just maybe, she remembered Anne Boleyn's fate and said, "Not me." Historians still debate whether Elizabeth was truly in love with Robert Dudley, her master of the horse. They exchanged letters, spent long hours alone, even shared a private tower suite for a while. But marriage? Never. And here's where things get deliciously ironic. Henry VIII destroyed Anne Boleyn to get a male heir. But that son, Edward VI, dies at 15. His half-sister Mary reigns briefly, then dies childless. And who takes the throne? Anne's daughter. The bastard. The girl too clever for her own good. The one whose very existence was called a mistake. Elizabeth I rules for 44 years. Her reign is considered a golden age. Talk about revenge by survival. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Back in Anne's posthumous shadow, something else is happening. Something you wouldn't expect. Fascination. Because despite the danger of saying her name aloud, people start collecting her. not in the creepy Victorian lock of hair under glass way. Yet, that comes later. But in the form of letters, portraits, whispered anecdotes, her life becomes a subject of obsession, not just for rebels or reformers, but even for those in power. There's a tantalizing mystery around Anne. How did she do it? How did she hold Henry's heart for 7 years? How did she climb so high, then fall so utterly? Quirky side note, her time in the French court as a young girl might have had something to do with it. You imagine her studying Queen Claude's manners, listening to court poets, learning not just how to curtsy, but how to weaponize wit. Anne came back to England fluent in French, dancing, and diplomacy. She wasn't just attractive, she was cultivated, a woman of edge in a world of softness, and that edge got her both the crown and the blade. Even today, some modern feminists look to Anne as a proto-icon, not for how she died, but for how she lived on her terms, however short those terms were. She refused to be a mistress. She insisted on a crown, and she paid for it. But that refusal to settle, that legacy sticks. In fact, let's talk legacy in the weirdest form, relics. There are rumors, unverified of course, that one of Anne's rings still exists, hidden in a private collection. Others claim a book of hours she once signed in the Tower still survives, with a chilling inscription written in her own hand. Remember me when you do pray, that hope doth lead from day to day. Hope. Even in the Tower. Even when all hope had been carved away like bone from meat. And this is where the horror twists again. Because Anne's execution wasn't just about death, it was about erasure. Henry wanted her gone and forgotten. Her titles stripped, her portraits removed, her initials scratched out from palace engravings. But not all of them. If you ever visit Hampton Court Palace, peer closely at the wood carvings in the Great Hall. Amidst the Tudor roses and lions, you'll find a few entwined initials, H and A, still surviving, forgotten by the stonemasons, spared by design? Historians still argue, but those letters stare back, stubborn and defiant. You think about those, initials often, 2 simple letters, once symbols of the grandest love in England, then symbols of treason, now symbols of defiance. The truth is, Anne Boleyn's story terrifies people because it's not a fairy tale. It's a cautionary tale wearing royal robes. A reminder that brilliance isn't always rewarded, that queens bleed, that sometimes you can do everything right and still get written out by someone stronger with a sword and a scribe. And yet, Anne writes herself back in. She becomes impossible to forget. Her story refuses to end neatly. And as you turn over, in bed, eyes fluttering toward the ceiling, you realize that's what makes it so deeply unsettling. Because if a queen can fall like that, so fast, so violently, what chance do any of us have? And then, just when your thoughts settle into dread, a softer one lands. She smiled before the blade. Remember that? You keep coming back to it. Not because it was brave, though it was. Not because it was dramatic, though definitely yes. But because, in that final second, Anne Boleyn reminded everyone that even stripped of title, power, and crown, she still had something Henry could never take, herself. And that might be the most frighteningly powerful thing of all. You shift slightly, blanket pulled a little tighter, because now the nightmare becomes strangely quiet. Anne is dead, executed, buried in a nameless grave under the tower's chapel floor, where the stones are worn smooth by centuries of indifferent footsteps. Her voice is gone, but her absence echoes, and for the people left behind, that absence becomes a political problem. The court, you see, is a living organism. It needs balance. Scandal throws it off. Everyone adjusts like dancers in a choreography rewritten mid-performance. You blink, and suddenly Jane Seymour is queen. Anne's ladies-in-waiting are scattered to the wind, and the Boleyn faction is treated like radioactive waste. Henry's court becomes a new kingdom overnight. But you can't wipe a person out that easily, not someone like Anne. And this is where things take a ghostly turn. Let's talk hauntings. You've probably heard that Anne Boleyn's ghost walks the tower, that she carries her head under one arm and floats through the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula like a sorrowful balloon, or that she appears on the anniversary of her death, staring out from the window of the Queen's house, her face pale and calm. Do people believe it? Well, guards have refused to work night shifts. Tourists have fainted. A yeoman warder once swore he saw a woman in Tudor dress glide down a hallway and vanish straight into a wall. And while most of us file that under good storytelling, the tower does seem to hum with something dense like history you can almost touch. But the real haunting is deeper. Not the rattle of chains, but the ripple in culture. Anne becomes folklore. Poems are written, ballads sung. Children's rhymes allude to Queen Anne with a face so fair, taken down the tower stair. And here's your quirky tidbit. In certain village superstitions, Anne becomes a symbol of feminine mischief. Some farmers once blamed poor crops on Queen Anne's curse, as if her death had offended nature itself. Historians still debate how quickly this folklore took root. Was it popular in her daughter's reign, or only much later once the safety of nostalgia kicked in? Either way, Anne becomes a story people can't stop telling. But back in the real political world, things grow tense again. Henry marries wife number 4, Anne of Cleves, in 1540. It's a disaster. He claims she looks nothing like her portrait, calls her the Flanders mare, which, let's be honest, is not a nickname you want from your husband. The marriage is annulled within months. No children, no drama, just awkward silence. Then comes Catherine Howard, Anne Boleyn's cousin. Now, there's a cursed family reunion no one asked for. Catherine is young, charming, and very, very naive. She's everything Anne wasn't, soft-spoken, playful, unstrategic. But her bloodline is the same. And the court starts whispering, another Boleyn girl in the Queen's bed. For a while, Henry seems enchanted. She's a breath of youth. But then the rumors start. Affairs, reckless letters, secret meetings, and suddenly the sword is polished once again. Catherine Howard is executed in 1542, accused of adultery, just like her cousin Anne. You almost laugh. Almost. It's the kind of cruel repetition that history thrives on. 2 queens, same family, same fate. And you wonder, did Catherine's ghost meet Anne's? Did they compare notes? And all this while, Elizabeth watches, quiet, calculating, learning. She's not just surviving. She's absorbing every lesson the court throws at her. Don't trust flattery. Don't rely on men. Don't marry a king who owns a personal executioner. You picture her holding her mother's ring, that one rumored to hold a miniature portrait of Anne inside. A secret talisman. Not because Elizabeth was sentimental, but because memory can be armor. And now, the tower shifts again. Years pass. Henry dies in 1547, bloated and increasingly paranoid. Edward becomes king, then dies. Mary takes the throne, Anne's old rival's daughter, and England trembles under a Catholic restoration. It's during Mary's reign that you feel the ghost of Anne walking loudest, because now Elizabeth is in real danger. Mary considers her a threat. After all, Elizabeth is Protestant, intelligent, popular. She looks too much like her mother. At one point, Mary even throws her into the tower, the same one Anne died in. The irony is nuclear. Can you imagine? Elizabeth pacing the same stone floor where Anne wept, sleeping in the same rooms, smelling the same damp air, listening for footsteps on the stairs, not courtiers, but jailers. And yet, Elizabeth survives. You don't get a golden age by being soft. Mary dies childless in 1558. And just like that, Anne's daughter is queen, fully, properly, indisputably. You want a plot twist? That's it. The child of the disgraced, decapitated queen now wears the crown her mother died for, and what does she do? She rules, not just for a few years, not just as a puppet, but as one of England's most formidable monarchs. She defeats the Spanish Armada, sponsors Shakespeare, establishes the Church of England, and most importantly, she never marries. Historians still argue why. Some claim trauma, others say political control, perhaps a bit of both. But one thing's certain, Elizabeth learned from Anne's rise and Anne's fall. She used the lessons, honed them, weaponized them, and in a twist both tragic and triumphant, Anne's horror becomes her daughter's blueprint. The mother was silenced, but the daughter, she speaks for centuries. Your breathing slows, but your mind won't let go. Because just when you think Anne Boleyn's story has finally laid itself to rest beneath that cold chapel stone, it lurches up again. This time not through hauntings or Tudor gossip, but through something even more lasting, legacy building. You see, once Elizabeth of I becomes queen, everything changes. Again, Anne Boleyn, the disgraced, the decapitated, the erased, suddenly becomes useful. Elizabeth is savvy. She knows that public memory is a weapon. And so she begins, quietly and carefully, to reclaim her mother's image. Not overtly. That would have been political dynamite. England still simmers with religious tension. The name Boleyn still burns in certain ears. But with small moves, subtle nods, Elizabeth reshapes the narrative. She keeps a few portraits of Anne, displaying them in private chambers. She surrounds herself with women from old Boleyn-connected families. She even commissions plays and pageants that, without naming Anne, celebrate clever, misunderstood women brought low by treachery. One of those court masks even features a heroine imprisoned in a tower, saved only by her daughter's rise to glory. Subtle, right? Historians still argue over how deliberate Elizabeth was in rehabilitating Anne's image. Was it a quiet campaign, or simply emotional residue leaking into her reign? Either way, the result is clear. Anne begins to shimmer again, not as a threat, but as a figure of tragic nobility. And here's where the narrative starts to crack open in a way that feels familiar. Because time moves forward, But people never stopped telling Anne's story. In the 1600s, ballads of Anne's last days are passed from village to village. By the 1700s, antiquarians start to catalogue her life like curious bugs under glass. By the 1800s, the Victorians go full melodrama, portraying Anne as a weeping martyr, hands clasped in prayer, betrayed by a monstrous husband and cruel fate. Picture Anne's ghost rolling her eyes at that one. Then comes the 20th century, and things get spicy again. Biographers dig deeper. Historians fight over the details. Was she guilty? Was she innocent? Was she a schemer, or simply outplayed? And then the media gets involved. Anne shows up in novels, TV dramas, miniseries. She becomes a fixture in classrooms and costume dramas. The other Boleyn girl phenomenon hits, and suddenly Anne is everywhere. Feisty, sexy, misunderstood, doomed. You get the version that leans feminist and the version that leans tabloid. Sometimes both. Quirky tidbit, at least 5 different. Actresses have played Anne Boleyn in major productions over the last 30 years, each bringing a wildly different take. Some make her steely, some make her soft, some make her nearly sociopathic. Apparently decapitation gets you a lot of range. But none of these versions seem to agree on the most basic thing. Who was she? That's the question that keeps the story going. Was she in love with Henry, or just after the crown? Did she encourage religious reform, or was she simply caught in it? Was she proud or paranoid, manipulative, or just ambitious? Historians still argue whether Anne truly understood the dangers of playing the Queen's game, or whether she, like so many, thought the rules didn't apply to her. And all the while, one quiet fact gets forgotten. We don't actually have much of Anne's own voice. Few letters survive, even fewer first-hand accounts. Most of what we know comes from people who wanted her gone, or wanted to use her memory for their own ends. Even her trial records were filtered through political necessity and personal vendetta, which means you've been haunted by a silence pretending to be a story. It's unnerving, isn't it? To realize that so much emotion, so much fear and fascination has been built around a woman who may never have said what you think she said, who may have laughed differently, walked differently, who may have known exactly what was coming and still refused to beg. You lie still and wonder, would you do the same? It's easy to imagine Anne as the tragic heroine, poised and trembling. But what if she wasn't? What if her final thoughts weren't sorrow, but rage? Not forgiveness, but fury? What if her silence wasn't submission, but defiance? Because that's the horror, right? That someone can lose their voice, their life, their story, and still, centuries later, be used, rewritten, recast by people who never knew her. It's almost a second execution, one that keeps repeating. But Anne, for all the erasures and reinventions, keeps surviving it. You can't kill a good story, and Anne Boleyn, for better or worse, is one of the best. She's the rise, the fall, the drama, the warning, the spark behind a golden age and the ghost behind a scaffold. She's ambition in heels, wit in velvet, a crown that cost too much, and a silence that cost more. And as your thoughts drift, a strange idea begins to form. Maybe Anne's true legacy isn't Elizabeth. Maybe it's not the ghost stories or the movies or the 1,000 whispered debates. Maybe Anne's legacy is us, still watching, still wondering, still unsettled, You shift again, sinking a little deeper into your blanket as the story drifts sideways into the strange twilight between history and myth. Because here's the twist no one really talks about. Anne Boleyn never belonged entirely to her own century. Oh, sure, she was born in the 1500s, spoke French, loved falconry, and dazzled courtiers with her sharp tongue and quicker wit. But Anne was always more than Tudor. She was the kind of figure who slips sideways into whatever age. She's remembered in a human mood ring, adapting her meaning to the temperature of the time. In the Reformation era, she's a symbol of progress, an English Joan of Arc ushering in religious reform. By the Catholic backlash, she's a Jezebel. By Elizabeth's reign, she's a half-whispered prayer. The Victorians? They make her a Gothic cautionary tale, weeping and pure. And modern media? She's every complicated woman ever told to smile more, obey faster, and speak less. That's the magic. That's the horror. That Anne Boleyn becomes whatever we need her to be. There's a word for this, you know. Palimpsest. It means something written, then scraped away, then written over again. Layers of meaning still faintly visible beneath the surface. Anne is the ultimate palimpsest. And each generation writes their fear, their admiration, their judgment on her. Even the architecture remembers her differently. You. Visit Hampton Court, and tour guides mention Queen Anne's chambers with a reverence more theatrical than accurate. You visit Hever Castle, her childhood home, and it's dripping with soft lighting, gift shops, and a gentle narrative that insists she was misunderstood and graceful and never had a bad hair day. But you don't see the ghosts in her letters, or the fire in her final prayers. Even her physical remains, remember those, are still debated. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Anne Boleyn was buried in an unmarked grave, remember? But in 1876, Queen Victoria ordered a restoration of the Tower Chapel, and several remains were exhumed. They tried to identify Anne's skeleton. One set of bones, they decided, fit the right age, the right stature. They moved them to a special spot under a black marble slab with her name. But historians still argue whether those bones were really hers. Some say the skeleton was too small, the jaw too narrow. Others claim the error is in the record-keeping. One scholar even suggests they might have accidentally honored another executed woman entirely, maybe one of the other wives or a lady-in-waiting. So even in death, Anne Boleyn's identity remains unsettled. You don't get neat closure with her. You get edges. That's what keeps you thinking long after the story's supposed to end. Because here's the creeping dread. Maybe Anne's worst punishment wasn't the sword. Maybe it was the way her story lost its anchor and drifted across time, reshaped by strangers with agendas. You imagine her watching from some afterlife balcony, eyebrow raised, arms crossed, muttering, "Seriously?" Every time someone casts her in another movie or misquotes her final speech. Or maybe she's laughing because in a strange, haunted way, she won, not the marriage, not the monarchy, but the memory. She got remembered, not forgotten like so many. Other queens and ladies and pawns. You remember Catherine Howard, right? The other young queen, the cousin, the one who died the same way. Most people barely do. But Anne, you can find 20 biographies, dozens of dramatizations, TikToks with flower crowns, and debates raging in Reddit threads at 3 in the morning. You're part of it right now, still awake, still following the sharp curve of her story, still wondering if the rumors were true. Let's play a little game while we're here, just you and me. Forget the official accounts. Set aside the dusty records and courtroom transcripts. Close your eyes for a moment and picture her, not the actress, not the painting, her, the real Anne, the woman behind the legend. Do you see a smirk on her face? Maybe a little sarcasm in the tilt of her head. Is she holding a letter, a prayer book, a cup of wine? Is she frightened or furious? You'll never know for sure. No one will. That's the unease and the allure. Because when history leaves a blank space, your imagination fills it in. And Anne Boleyn is mostly blank space. That's what makes her dangerous. People fear what they can't pin down. And Anne? She's unpin-downable. Yes, that's a made-up word, but Anne would have approved. She's both victim and architect, both innocent and ambitious. A woman who broke the rules and paid for it with her head, but refused to vanish, which brings us back to the bed you're lying in now. Because somewhere, sometime, someone else will do what you're doing tonight. Turn out the light, press play on a story about Anne Boleyn, and find themselves tangled in her shadow. The horror isn't just what happened to her, it's how close you feel to it. Your eyes are heavier now, but Anne won't let you go just yet, because the true horror, it's not just in the scaffold, or the silence, or the forgotten bones. No, it's in the realization that Anne Boleyn's fall wasn't just about her. It was about the world she lived in, and the way that world still echoes today. Let's rewind the curtain and take one more slow look around that glittering Tudor court. Not the jewels and silks, but the system itself, the gears grinding under the velvet. Everything ran on reputation. Your power came from being seen, being whispered about, being admired but not too admired, intelligent but not threatening, desirable but not scandalous. It was like walking a tightrope in a thunderstorm, blindfolded and with knives being thrown at you from the audience. For men, dangerous, sure. For women, lethal. Anne wasn't executed just because Henry got bored or angry or guilt-ridden. Was executed because she broke too many invisible rules. She didn't stay in her box. She reached too high. She challenged the idea that a woman could only influence quietly, from the shadows. She wanted to be more than ornamental, and that, more than any alleged affair or poison plot, is what made her dangerous. You feel that unease, don't you? That low hum beneath the drama, because it's not just about the past, it's a mirror. How many times have you seen powerful women still punished today for being too much, too assertive, too confident, too loud, too emotional, too intelligent, too ambitious, too inconvenient? Anne's story isn't a dusty Tudor tragedy. It's a modern anxiety in Renaissance costume. That's what unsettles you the most. And here's something most people never realize. Anne Boleyn's enemies didn't just want her dead. They wanted her erased. They went after her portraits, her letters, her memory. They tried to snuff her out completely, like a candle in a drafty hall. The horror isn't just the sword. It's the systematic effort to make sure no one ever remembered why the sword fell. Quirky tidbit. After Anne's death, Henry VIII went out of his way to scrub traces of her from royal palaces. Her initials, those elegant A and H monograms, were chipped out of stone. Her falcon badge disappeared from tapestries. It was like a Tudor version of block and delete. But they missed a few. Even now at Hampton Court, you can still find one or two faded carvings with A+H entwined, like lovers' graffiti, ghosts in the architecture. Quiet resistance in stone. It gives you a weird kind of chill, doesn't it? Like the building itself refused to forget her. And maybe that's the only reason Anne survived. Not just in books and shows and YouTube videos. Like this one. But in the cracks, the mistakes, the whispers. History tried to bury her. But you can't bury a story that powerful. It grows back. In novels, in music, in retellings like this one, stretched across midnight airwaves. And that brings us to one final uncomfortable thought before you drift off. What if Anne knew? What if she sensed, somewhere in those final hours, that she was becoming something larger than her life? That her death would spark not just pity, but curiosity? Because here's the shiver. We remember Anne not because she was perfect, or virtuous, or cruelly wronged, but because she was real, flawed, sharp, brave, reckless, brilliant, and human. And that humanity, trapped inside a centuries-old tragedy, is what keeps us awake, telling and retelling her story, hoping that maybe this time we'll understand her. Spoiler, we won't, but we'll keep trying. Because deep down, part of you knows that the moment you stop wondering about Anne Boleyn is the moment the story wins. The erasers win. The scaffold wins. And you're not going to let that happen, are you? Not while you can still listen. Not while you can still imagine the whisper of satin skirts in a candlelit corridor, or the sudden hush of a court turning on its queen, or the cold, steely breath of a French executioner counting under his breath. So you stay with her a little longer, even if your eyes start to close, even if the shapes in your room soften and blur, even if the world quiets around you, because Anne is still here. Not just in history books, not just in tower stones, but here, now in your breath and bones and the strange stillness of this midnight. And the truth, the horror, is that she never really left. She just waits. To be remembered, to be heard, to rise again. One word, one story, one sleepless night at a time. You stir just a little, not because you're restless, but because something in you senses the final chapters approaching. Not the end of the story, but the edge of it. The place where narrative gives way to echoes. And Anne's echoes? They get louder the closer you get to now. Let's drift back one more time to that pale morning at the tower. The execution already finished. The body taken away. The crowd dispersing like fog under sun. And you, still there, as if unable to move. Your feet rooted to the cobbles, because it's not just Anne who haunts that place. It's what her death set into motion. You remember Elizabeth, right? The daughter she left behind? The one everyone thought too scandalous to matter? Well, Elizabeth didn't just survive the shadow of her mother. She rose above it. She wore it like armor. When she became queen decades later, she never publicly spoke Anne's name, never avenged her, never held court in a fit of drama about the past, but she did wear Anne's famous pearl necklace. She did keep Anne's books, and she did rule, unmarried, sharp-tongued, terrifyingly clever, for 44 years. That's not a coincidence. That's a legacy. Some historians still argue whether Elizabeth's refusal to marry was a political strategy or a psychological scar left by her mother's fate. Was she avoiding becoming a pawn, like Anne had been? Or simply refusing to let any man hold power over her? Maybe both. Or maybe Elizabeth, in her silence, was saying more than words ever could. Maybe every decision she made as queen was a whispered, "I remember." That's the horror and the hope. Anne's death didn't erase her. It fractured history. And from that fracture, something unexpected grew. But not all the echoes are empowering. Because for centuries afterward, Anne was still used more as a symbol than a woman. The Victorians turned her into a tragic damsel. The early 20th century made her into a romantic rebel. And somewhere along the way, we all started projecting ourselves onto her like she was a blank screen. Sometimes she's a proto-feminist, sometimes a cautionary tale, sometimes a villain, sometimes a martyr. She's been blamed for everything from church division to royal family dysfunction. She's also been credited with launching England into modernity. Imagine being remembered for 500 years, but never the same way twice. That's enough to make you sit up in bed and mutter, "Girl deserved better." And here's a little weird trivia to keep in your back pocket. One of Anne's surviving belongings is a small gold locket ring. When it was opened, centuries later, it was found to contain 2 tiny portraits. One of Elizabeth, and one of a woman believed to be Anne herself. Historians still argue whether the ring was Elizabeth's private tribute to her mother or just a fashionable keepsake. But either way, it's one of the few physical links between them. One of the few proofs that Anne lived on, not just in legend, but in a daughter's secret locket. And you feel that, don't you? The unbearable intimacy of it. Because all this time you've been listening to a story that feels big, court politics, religion, rebellion. But it comes down to something small. One woman, one life, one voice, silenced. And now it's yours in the telling. You've walked beside her through the glitter and the grime. You've seen her smirk and her sorrow. You've felt the weight of that blindfold, the bite of betrayal, the cold of steel, and you've survived it. Well, mostly. There's still a part of you, curled beneath your blanket, that feels like you're not quite alone, that Anne is watching, somewhere on the edges, curious if you got it right. Or at least, close enough. Because that's the gift, and the curse of her story. It always asks more questions than it answers. Why did Henry really turn on her? Was she guilty of anything more than ambition? Did she feel regret? Was she afraid? Was she angry? You'll never know. But you will wonder. And that wondering, that's how she lives on. Anne Boleyn doesn't haunt the tower. She haunts your mind, your imagination, your sense of justice. Your late-night curiosity. Every time you feel that prick of unfairness, that catch in your throat at a story cut short, that itch for a truth buried under centuries of edits. That's her. That's Anne. Still sharp, still dangerous, still unforgettable, and maybe that's what she wanted more than anything. Not a crown, not a husband, not even a clear verdict, just to matter. And oh, Anne, you did. You do, even now. By now your room is impossibly quiet, like even the walls are listening. But you you're still here, suspended between sleep and story, and Anne's voice, however faint, hasn't let go of you yet. Because we're not done. There's one final place we have to visit before we let her go. And that place? It's not a palace or courtroom or tower cell. It's the space where truth and myth collide, the long, winding corridor of memory. Anne's memory was a battlefield for centuries, and depending on who controlled the narrative, she was either a witchy seductress who corrupted a good king, or a Protestant heroine who suffered for faith and reform. Neither of those versions is quite right. But neither is completely wrong either. That's the thing about Anne. She's a mirror. People see what they want in her, or what they fear, or what they think a woman should never be. And as you shuffle closer to the edge of sleep, there's a strangely modern horror in that. Because it means Anne never got to rest. She's been dragged. Across centuries of ink and drama, her image reprinted and recast and rebooted more than Spider-Man. There are more biographies of her than of most U.S. presidents. She shows up in plays, operas, musicals, films, memes, even high fashion. One designer in the 2000s did an entire runway collection inspired by Anne's execution gown. Quirky? Yep. Kind. Of spooky? Also, yes. Historians still argue whether Anne would have loved the attention or despised it. Would she be flattered by Natalie Dormer's sultry smirk in the Tudors, or side-eyeing every costume with plastic pearls and zero historical accuracy? You get the sense she'd probably be annoyed she still had to explain herself 500 years later. But also, maybe she'd be proud. Because the one thing Anne Boleyn never wanted was to disappear. And despite everything, decapitation, disgrace, literal historical erasure, she never did. But memory, like power, is a fickle thing. And Anne's memory didn't just float gently down through history. It got torn up, rewritten, misused. In some circles, she was literally demonized. Centuries after her death, rumors still swirled about her having 6 fingers, a 3rd nipple, or using witchcraft to seduce the king. None of it was true, but none of it had to be. The legend was too juicy to fact-check. Anne became a cautionary tale and an icon, a warning and a wish. And somewhere in the fog of all that contradiction, the real woman vanished. That's the horror of fame. Not being remembered. Incorrectly, but being remembered only in pieces. Your edges smoothed, your flaws exaggerated, your voice replaced. So tonight, as you lie there in the dark, maybe what Anne really needs isn't justice or vengeance or another moody period drama. Maybe she just needs someone to imagine her as she was. Not the queen, not the victim, just the woman, witty, determined, sometimes petty, sometimes radiant, often underestimated, a woman who liked music and poetry and clever debates, who probably rolled her eyes way more often than was appropriate. In court, who fought like hell to protect her daughter and failed, but also didn't. You imagine her at a window, not in the tower, earlier, maybe at Greenwich, when the court was still golden and the crown still glittered. She's watching the river, fingers tapping a lute, brow furrowed in thought. She's planning something, not her downfall. Something better, you don't know what. But for a second, she feels real. Not tragic, not terrifying, just present. And that feeling, that's what breaks the spell. Gently, because now the story isn't chasing you anymore. It's settled beside you. Like Anne herself has curled up at the edge of your bed, chin resting on her hand, smirking slightly at how seriously you've taken all of this. She would have liked the drama, though. She always did have a flair for an entrance and an exit, but now it's time to let her go, because she's not yours to keep. And in some strange way, that's the best tribute of all, to not own her, to just hold her story for a while, then pass it on, like a secret, like a spark, like a ghost in silk. You exhale without meaning to, like something inside you is releasing at last. This is the end. You know it. Not just the end of Anne's tale, but the strange grip she's had on you tonight. And yet, there's one last thing you can't quite shake. The question of legacy. Because if we're being honest, Anne Boleyn's death didn't just echo through time, it rewrote it. Let's rewind to a small but seismic point. Her execution wasn't just the end of a woman. It was the climax of a national shift, a religious earthquake, a redefinition of monarchy. England never looked the same afterward. Henry didn't wait long after the axe fell, 11 days, to be exact. That's how fast he married Jane Seymour. 11 days. Most people take longer to reorder their sock drawer. It was like Anne had been deleted from his life with the precision of a royal backspace key. But here's where it gets weirder. After all that fire and fury, after breaking from the Catholic Church, after executing his wife and friends, after reshaping a kingdom to get Anne, Henry barely spoke of her again. Historians still argue whether he truly mourned her in private, or simply compartmentalized it like a Tudor-era CEO who had quarterly thrown targets to hit. He never restored her name, never cleared her reputation. And yet, he made Elizabeth, her daughter, his heir again before he died. What do you do with that? What do you do with a man who destroyed a woman to the point of historical oblivion, then quietly allowed her child to inherit everything? Maybe guilt, maybe pragmatism. Maybe it was just Henry being Henry, a contradiction in tights. And Elizabeth? She never married, never had children. Her reign was long, glittering, terrifying, and iconic, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, but also Anne's daughter. The living reminder that the woman buried in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula had not been erased. Not completely. And Elizabeth didn't just survive the stain of Anne's scandal. She weaponized it. She studied how her mother had been adored and then destroyed. She learned where power lives and where it pretends to. And when people tried to reduce her to a marriage prospect or a puppet, she outplayed them all. You can almost see Anne's ghost, nodding in approval somewhere in the corridors of Whitehall. But even so, Anne's reputation remained fragile. For centuries, the mainstream painted her with extremes, either the vixen who ruined everything, or the victim who suffered nobly. Either way, she was more symbol than substance. Only recently have historians started to nudge the spotlight closer to her actual self, to study her letters, to examine the politics she understood, the faith she defended, the risks she took. One of the quirkiest finds. A poem Anne possibly wrote in the tower. If it's truly hers, it's short, simple, and quietly devastating. It doesn't scream injustice or beg for sympathy. It just exists, like her. They've never proved she wrote it. They might never know. But the mystery itself feels like her. So what does it all mean? It means Anne Boleyn didn't just die. She transformed from pawn to queen, from queen to traitor, from traitor to memory. And maybe that's the final horror and the final wonder. That one woman, so sharp, so vivid, so maddeningly real, could become something so spectral, so endlessly debated, so eternal. Because now, as you lie there in the hush of midnight, it's not Henry or Cromwell or Chapuis you remember. It's her, and her story's not finished. It never really is. Not while someone, somewhere, is still whispering her name. Not while the tower stands. Not while pearls glint in candlelight. Not while daughters remember mothers, even when the world tells them to forget. And now, finally, your eyes grow heavier. Your breath slows. The sharpness of Anne's world fades into something softer, quieter, like silk slipping through fingers. The tower becomes just a shape in the mist. The voices hush. The footsteps retreat. You've walked a long road tonight, from palace intrigue to whispered secrets to that pale scaffold at dawn. And now it's behind you. All of it. Let the noise drain out. Let the questions float away. There's no rush to resolve them now. You've done enough just by listening. Anne's story is no longer tragedy or horror or history alone. It's a lullaby of resistance, a flicker of defiance, a woman's voice echoing in a world that tried to silence it. And here you are, still hearing her. So breathe in. Feel the stillness settle around you like a cloak. You're safe now. Far from the judgment, far from the swords, far from the thunder of royal decree, she can rest, and so can you. Let her final smile carry you into dreams. Let the weight of her crown dissolve. Let the night be gentle. Sleep deeply, traveler. You've earned it.